First step, first reality, taking up the cross. Very simple. Empty yourself. But to take up the cross, we must do that. But he didn't stop there. Look what else the passage says. Not only did he empty himself, but in verse 8 it says, he humbled himself. Oh, think of the indignity he allowed himself to be submitted to. Think of how he was treated. Think of how even his disciples treated him. Think of what they did with him. They didn't always honor him. They tried to take advantage of him at times. In this study, we have seen Peter rebuking him. We've seen James and John manipulating him. We've seen Judas betraying him. We've seen the Pharisees accusing him. We've seen Herod mocking him and Pilate shaming him. You know, in leadership sometimes, you have to go through some very hard things. If you're in local church ministry, maybe you've experienced some disrespect. Maybe the sheep have turned on you. Maybe they have undermined you. Maybe they haven't valued you. Very interesting to read 1 Peter 2, where Jesus is held up as a model, even as he is in Philippians 2, and to read how God has respect for those who suffer unjustly, even as Jesus did. To humble ourselves under injustice for Christ's sake. That's how we take up the cross. And finally, there's one last statement. He became obedient in verse 8 to death, even death on a cross. He sacrificed himself. Sacrifice gets old, doesn't it? Whether it be in ministry or in business, leaders end up sacrificing themselves. Other people go home at 5, but you're there till 7, 8, 9. So they can start tomorrow morning at 8 and make a living. And for long periods of time, you pay them and not yourself. Because you're sacrificing for the sake of others. It's how we take up the cross. I can't do this. Only Jesus can enable me to do this. So how do we take up the cross? By doing what Jesus did. By his grace, by his enablement, crying out to him, Lord, I can't keep this up. I can't do this. I don't have it. Come and do in me what you had to do yourself. Teach me. Help me to understand what your sufferings are like. Help me to identify with you. Help me to be in touch with you. Help me to empty myself. Help me to humble myself. Help me to sacrifice myself, even when I don't want to do it, especially when I don't want to do it. Now, you may not know this, but we're going to return to the Gospel of Mark, and you may not realize actually what Mark was ultimately writing about. We know the message of his book began in Mark 1:1 when he introduced the good news concerning the Christ, the Son of God. That was his caption. That was his subject. Jesus as the Son of God. That was his subject in Mark 1:1. But why did he write this gospel? What made him write it? You see, every book in the Bible occurs for a reason. You just don't have books that are suddenly appearing from nowhere. Every book in the Bible occurs for a reason. And the great question is, what was the reason for the Gospel of Mark? Let me give you some background. When Mark wrote his Gospel, he lived in Rome. He probably came there with Peter, or he joined Peter there. He was close to Peter, and Paul was probably there some of the same time, but not as a free man. Because you see, there was a persecution going on. Nero, who had decided to have an urban reclamation project, had set fire to part of Rome. Now the problem is, Rome was a city built out of wood. And many of the buildings in Rome were about 5 stories high because that's as much as the engineering could handle. Amazingly enough, some of them actually had heat, like on the first floor or 2. Quite surprising. But the streets were very narrow. And if someone started a fire in tinder, dry wood and narrow streets with any kind of a breeze at all, it would take no time until there was a huge conflagration and people would get trapped. And you can see people who are asleep. This was done at night. Nero's henchmen started this fire, and it was done at night, and when it got out of control, it got carried away. I don't think he intended to kill people. No Roman emperor, no one, not even a Roman emperor, could get away with that. But once it was out of control, scores and scores and scores of people were killed. And the reaction was powerful. And Nero needed to blame somebody. And the Christians who, at this point in time, were just starting to resist emperor worship, it was starting to catch on and they were resisting it. The Christians who were out of step with the rest of Rome, even Christians in the emperor's quarters, because Paul talked about the fact that through the Praetorian Guard and others, when he was under house arrest, people in Caesar's household came to Christ. They were different. They didn't do what Caesar wanted them to do. And so Caesar started a persecution, blaming the Christians for this fire. And his persecution was horrible. So cruel. He used living Christians as torches for some of his garden parties. He burned them alive. He fed them to the lions. The persecution was incomprehensible. Paul, who was probably in Spain at that time, was arrested and brought back to Rome and probably beheaded. Peter, who was in Rome, ended up, by his own choice, it would appear, crucified upside down. And the Romans began to ask a question. Here's the question. Who is this Jesus that we must die for him?